This morning, I woke up and I was thinking about fear of the future. Now, I'm not one who's necessarily paranoid. I'm not a prepper type. I'm not a person who necessarily thinks that the worst things are going to happen. I'm usually pretty positive. But I noticed that there was this fear. Just underline, it's not like a huge fear of mine, but there still is this fear of the unknown, fear of things that may happen in the future. There's a lot of headlines in the news that are pretty dire. Depending on who you listen to, you think the world's ending right now. But I don't necessarily buy into all of that. But of course, there's things that are happening around the world that are not necessarily good. And there's a lot of people that are suffering in the world as a result of it. And as any human on this planet who is paying attention to what's going on around them, you probably have some, maybe just a little, concern about what's happening in the future or what may happen in the future. Even if it's not really going to happen at all, but, we've been conditioned to be concerned about what the future holds. And so we often do think about those things, and in a not so positive light. And with that comes fear. And so this morning, I was thinking a little bit about fear, about the fear that I feel. And what was interesting is that as I started asking myself if I can let this go, let this concern about the future go, let this fear of the future go, the word fright came up. Now, I don't typically use that word. In fact, can't even remember the last time I used it. Typically we hear the word frightened, like, oh, that person was frightened. And sometimes you'll hear the word fright used in some kind of weird slogan during Halloween or something like that. But typically that word fright is not something that I either hear much or that I use in my own vocabulary. And so when this word came up, it was actually kind of interesting because I was thinking that was the specific word that described something that my unconscious brought to my attention. And my mind went back to a time when I was very young, when I was being babysat by an older cousin of mine. I don't remember how old I was. I might have been 5 years old, maybe, if that. And my cousin was a teenager, or maybe an early teen, maybe 13 or 14 or something like that. And so she had turned on the TV and I think my mom and dad had gone out on a date or something, I don't know. And then, so she was watching over me and she turned the TV on and she was into watching, I guess, horror films and things like that. This was a long time ago. So the horror films back then that were on TV, they weren't nearly as bad as what people see these days, but they can still be frightening to a young child. And she turned on the movie, I think it was a black and white movie, Dracula. And so it was an old movie, but I had not been exposed to that stuff before that. And I was very young, and as I was watching it, I was getting frightened. And that the only reason I think that I have a memory of that time was because of the fear I had at the moment that was going on. So, as I think about it now, I don't necessarily feel the fright, but I remember that instant, and I remember that I was afraid, that I had felt fear. And so that fright came back, and not necessarily as a feeling, but or at least not the way I experience it today. But I think that this fear of the future was actually tied to that fright that I felt. Almost like that fright encoded in me something that I now interpret as fear of the future. And then my mind jumped back to even an earlier time in my childhood that I distinctly remember going to a drive-in movie with my mom and dad, and the movie was called The Hammer of God. And it was like a early 70s movie, I think. And it was a kung fu movie when a lot of people were getting killed and all that kind of stuff within the movie. And again, that was a movie that was very graphic for me at that age, and it frightened me. So I started doing this release of the fright. Feel the fright and then go into it and let it go. And I noticed that I just let it go. Could I let it go? Would I let it go? And when? And asked myself and went through that. Now, there's still residuals of that, and I'm probably going to have to do some more of this, but that I identify it, and instead of ignoring it or going, oh yeah, I was just a dumb kid back then and those things aren't that scary anymore. Instead of doing that, I looked at it and I looked at myself as a child with compassion, saying, you know what? For a little child watching that at that time, that was very frightening. And it's important to acknowledge that and then go ahead and release the fear by allowing yourself to feel the child's fear and let it go. That's what I did, and that's what I'm going to continue doing until I feel it no more, because that contributes to the fear that I have today. Any fear that I may have of the future, of anything that's going on in the world today, having that fright encoded in me early only reinforces what I feel now as far as fear. So I don't want to feel fear. I want to feel comfortable in the openness of non-fear. I want to feel love. And when a person feels fear, that is when they push love aside, because the fear grips them, and then they end up reacting out of fear. A person will react out of fear even with people who they love, because at the time that reaction, that gut reaction takes control of that person, and that person cannot then respond out of love because it's not the person's natural state. So I want my natural state to be love, response out of love instead of reaction out of fear. And in order to do that, I must release the fear, let that fear go. Just watch it, feel it, acknowledge it, and let it go. So this is something you can do as well. Look back at the times in your life. Think of the times when you were a little child that that come to mind that you remember. Maybe and the thing is that when you look at your childhood memories, when you review them in your mind, a lot of times you will see that those memories are associated with a strong emotion. Sometimes it's joy, elation, excitement, but in a majority of cases, it probably has to do with something traumatic, something that was that engulfed you in fear, anger. Maybe you felt extreme loneliness or sadness, or maybe there was like a feeling of depression that came over you and suddenly because of some event that happened in your life. And if you go back to those times and recall those events, you can start to review them and allow yourself to bring up those feelings and then just let them go. Ask yourself, could I let this go? Could I let this feeling go? Would I let it go? And when? And even if you think that you've already let it go, there may be things about that instance in your life that is still an aspect that you're holding on to. And see if there is. If you feel anything come up in your chest or your gut, go ahead and just ask yourself, can I let this sensation go? Would I let it go, and when? And by practicing that and letting those feelings go, you'll find you'll become more open and that those emotions control you less and less. Well, that's all I have for today. Ciao.